Hello students, and welcome to your second lecture and your first asynchronous lecture. Before you proceed with this lecture, you should have done two things by now. The first is you should have read that short document I gave you to read called the Peloponnesian War. And the second is to have looked at that YouTube video on the animated life of Socrates. Both of those things are available on the Brightspace module in the Essential Reading, Writing and Listening folder. If you haven't done those things yet, then don't proceed with this lecture until you have done so. Once you have completed listening to this lecture, you then need to go and read The Apology by Plato. You'll find a copy of The Apology on Brightspace, or if you look at the link below there highlighted in blue, if you click on that, you'll also find a copy of it. Now, this is probably the toughest reading you're going to have for the entire semester, and there's no getting away from that, I'm afraid. It's quite tough because the language seems a bit clunky because it was written 400 BCE. So in other words, almost 2,500 years ago. And it was written in ancient Greek, and obviously it's translated into English. So please give yourself plenty of time to read it. When you're doing an academic text, the best way always to read it is to read it once straight through. Even bits you don't understand, just keep reading it. The second time you read it, you go over it with a highlighter and highlight what you think are the important bits in the text. And then the third and final time you read it, you just read the highlighted text. So that's a kind of a general rule right the way through this module. If I give you something to read it once, all in one go to get a sense of it, even the stuff you don't understand. Go over them more slowly the second time with a highlighter, highlighting the important parts. And then the third and final time you read it, just read the pieces you've highlighted. It's a really good idea to read those highlighted pieces just before you come into the lecture on that topic. So when I talk to you next week on Tuesday at 11 o'clock on a live lecture or synchronous lecture, I'll be assuming you've read The Apology by Plato, and that's what we'll be discussing. When you're reading any academic text, particularly in the humanities or for that matter in the social sciences, there's a few things you should always keep in mind as you're reading them. The easiest way to understand any text is to think of it as an opportunity to answer questions. So before you go and read something like The Apology, have a pen and paper beside you and write down a few questions before you start. And the kind of typical questions you should always start at is, where is the event taking place? So if I ask you next week, where is The Apology situated? You should be able to tell me, so what place in the world is it situated in? The second thing you should always know the answer to is when. So when are the events happening? To the closest sort of 20, 30 years, okay? So again, I might say to you, when was the Apology written? And you might say to me, it was written in, let's say, 398 BCE. So something like that. And the other thing, which is really, really important for students of the humanities, history, philosophy, is to know what was happening at the same time. So anything that goes on at the moment, for example, if you think about, COVID, what's going on at the same time as COVID? Well, there's an American presidential election going on. That's one of the things that's happening. So when we look at other things that are happening around the event, we call that the historical context. In other words, what's going on when this other thing is going on? And all good students of humanities are always able to answer those questions. Where is the event happening? When is the event happening? And what is also going on at the same time as the event, the historical context? Adding to that, of course, we have to be able to answer some other questions as we're reading and writing in the humanities. The first thing you should obviously know is, what is the title of the work you have read? So obviously in this case, it is The Apology by Plato. But do you know what the word apology means? And again, you'll often find in the humanities, words that we use every day in English have a slightly different meaning. So again, you might want to go and Google it, look it up. What could apology mean in this context? The next thing you should always know is who wrote the book. So who wrote the piece you were reading? Who's the author? And this will become more obvious to you as you study in the humanities, why it's really, really important to know the title, but also to know the author almost off the top of your head. That becomes critical. Finally, and more importantly, anything you read will be giving you its idea of how they think things should be. And this goes for anything from newspapers to books to journal articles. But the person who wrote the article or wrote the book, where did they get their information? What is the source of their information? Because as you'll learn to understand over the next couple of weeks, that really matters because some sources are more reliable than others. So if I read an account of something happening at the moment in the world, and one source says one thing and another source says almost the exact opposite, which one should I believe? In other words, how do I identify the more credible source? Or how do I identify the more reliable source? When we look at those sources, we ask questions like, well, what do those people do? How involved are they with what they're writing about? Do they have vested interests? Are they friends, family members? Do they share the same political opinions? In other words, are they using this as an opportunity to make an argument that suits themselves, or are they using this as an opportunity to try and tell the truth or a type of truth? These are all things that are worth considering when you're reading any academic text, be it in the humanities or in science. So again, as you're reading the text, I've given you a few pointers so far, and everything I've said so far is relevant to everything you're going to read between now and Christmas. The other thing, and this is the most difficult thing when you're reading academic texts, is to try and work out what are the main points that the author is trying to make. Okay, and again, when you're reading for that third time the highlighted text, you should have a pen and paper beside you always. And you should be writing down what you think the main points the author is trying to make. In other words, what argument is the author making? What are the things the author wants you to go away knowing? One of the ways to think about this is if you read the text and you met a friend for a coffee, and the friend said to you, oh, what is the apology about? So you'd probably be able to tell them the story of what happened. But if your friend said, well, what's the key message that the author wants you to take away from that? That's the hard bit. That's the argument. Now, this is also true if you're into film or you go to the cinema. You know, if your friend said to you, what's that film like? You might say good, you might say bad. But if your friend said to you, well, what were the things the film wanted you to go away knowing or thinking about? Okay, how would you answer that? This takes practice. And one of the skills that you get or that you acquire as a student of the humanities is the skill to understand an argument that somebody else is making, but also the skill to make an argument for yourself. How do you do that? And that doesn't happen in a couple of weeks, that takes years. So if at the beginning of this module you're finding this difficult and you're finding the readings difficult, that's completely normal. It's a bit like if you've ever tried to start going to the gym or take up a sport or start walking or trying to get fit. You know, the first couple of days, weeks is actually really, really difficult. But after a while, it gets a little bit easier. And hopefully it gets to the point where you even miss doing it when you don't do it. It's really the same with reading. You will never be able to write well, ever, unless you read well. So there is no way of getting around reading. And I think I've said this to you before, but if you don't like reading, humanities is certainly not the module for you to do. Sometimes when writers are making their argument, what they try and do is they try and give you examples. So I think an example is a way of illustrating your argument. In other words, it's a way of saying, well, this is what I think, but let me give you a real world example of why I think that. Okay, because I've observed something, or I've measured something, or I've data from something. Okay, or in a certain case, this is what happened. If we think about voting, that's a very easy one. You know, people will make the argument that certain groups of people vote more than others. How do they know that? They have to measure it. So they might give an example. So if you look, for example, in Dublin at the moment, the northeast inner city and the southeast inner city are the two places in all of Ireland that vote the least. And that is an example to make an argument that city people, for example, vote less maybe than country people. That's the beginning, but then the question becomes, well, why is that the case? And you have to go and find more sources and do more research. But they're the kind of skills we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. Also, when you're reading anything for the humanities, or again, for that matter, the social sciences, one of the things you should also know the answer to is what kind of a text are you reading? And there are lots of different kinds of text. So there, you'll see there's just beside me a list of different types. A novel, most of you will have read novels at this point, they're usually fiction. So they're made up stories from the present or for the past or even from the future. Then you have biographies, and biographies are books about people written by other people. So if you read a biography of Socrates by somebody else, that's your kind of classic biography. An autobiography is when somebody writes a book about themselves. And again, ask yourself this question at this point: which do you think would be more reliable in general terms? a biography of somebody, or an autobiography of somebody. Then you also will have a short story. That's not something you read very often in the humanities, but if you study English literature or French literature, you'll do that. That's usually a story of 10, 15 pages, again, fiction, very short, a very snappy piece of information, usually written to entertain. You then have an essay, and you will be writing quite a lot of essays, both in the humanities and in the social sciences. And the key thing about an essay, unlike maybe what you learned in school, in college, an essay always has an argument. And you really, really, really need to remember that. So you're putting forward an argument to me. You're telling me, why Socrates is an important philosopher to understand. Why was Napoleon a great leader, or was Napoleon a great leader? You're making that argument. A report is a much simpler thing. It's just a list of findings, a list of things you've collected. It tells me, it's descriptive. It tells me what you saw. It tells me maybe what you recommend. And it doesn't contain an argument. That's the difference in a report and an essay. The other thing about an essay is it has to be read from beginning to end. You can't just dip in the middle and read it. It won't make any sense. Whereas a report has sections, and you can actually just read a section that might be relevant to you. So for example, if I'm writing a report on Dublin, it may include things like the population of the city, the buildings of the city. It may include, for example, the geography of the city. But if I'm only interested in one of those things, I only have to read that section. So again, if a lecturer asks you to write a report, or if they ask you to write an essay, do know the difference. They are quite different. A poem is simply that. It uses a very small amount of words to express very complicated feelings. In fact, people who are able to write poems well tend to have a very strong ability, linguistic ability in using language. A play is something where the dialogue is written and where people perform that dialogue. Plays are often written to entertain, but actually in the past, particularly in ancient Greece, plays were used as things you went to very often to learn news, what was going on in the world. So they reenacted maybe battles or reenacted famous events, or it was where you went to find out how you should behave as a good person or a bad person. There was a good guy and a bad guy, and you should be like the good guy, but not like the bad guy. A dialogue is a conversation between two or more people, like a play, but not meant to be performed necessarily. Okay, anytime you see die, it usually means two or more from that Greek. A book, I think we all know what a book is, at least I hope we all know what a book is. And a book, again, is made up of chapters, and each chapter will have a different theme or something it will want to say different to the chapter beforehand. And again, as we go through this module, I'll very often be asking you to read chapters from books as opposed to the entire book. A newspaper, I think hopefully we know what that is. And again, a newspaper, they were designed to tell us news on a day-by-day basis. A magazine, it's not so immediate. So an article in a magazine could, for example, be read weeks or months after it was written. It can be not necessarily connected to what's going on at the moment. A web article is something that's published on the internet. And we have to be very careful about what websites we use when we're studying, because some websites are much more reliable than others. And I think we all know at this point that there's a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation available online. So when you are doing research for your essays, I will be pointing you towards certain websites and away from others. So for example, one of the world's most used websites, Wikipedia, comes with a major health warning, because anybody can write anything and put it up on Wikipedia. So how reliable is that? It can sometimes be a good place to start, but when you look at the bottom of a Wikipedia article, it will tell you where it got its information from. And sometimes those sources can be tabloid newspapers, or they can be other websites, so not very reliable. So be very, very careful when you're using web articles to make an argument, to write an essay, or to write a report. And then finally, you have what's called a journal article. Now, academic journals tend to be very reliable because the information is checked by other academics before it's published. TU Dublin spends approximately €750,000 a year on academic journals, electronic ones. So these are ones that are available online. Now, you will get a lecture, probably from your study skills lecture, on how to access electronic journals through the internet, through the web. And it takes a little while to get used to accessing those, but they're the ones that are most reliable and they're the ones that are most recent. And when I look at your essays, they'll be the ones that I expect you to use the most. Okay, so just remember that as you're doing that research, and be very careful of Wikipedia. So as you begin your reading and as you begin your study of the humanities, one of the most fundamental questions you have to answer yourself is, what makes a good historian? Is it just somebody who goes and reads a couple of history books, remembers them, and then is able to tell people what they saw? In fact, when we talk about history as a study at university level, we're looking for a set of other characteristics that describe good historians. The first word that comes to mind usually is the word unbiased. In other words, that the historian tries to tell the truth without regard to what he or she thinks themselves about the way the world should be or could be or should have been or would have been. Now that's very difficult because we all have our own biases. For example, the things that we believe, be it religious, be it political, be it how we think about our own country or the world, can actually influence how we tell a story. We can put certain emphasis on things. Those of you who have had an interest in history so far, if you look back over what you read, you'll notice there are some common themes, and certain groups are put center forward of the story and certain groups are ignored. So until very recently, in fact, as historians wrote history, it tended to be about very famous people. It tended to be mostly about men. It tended mostly about European men. And really, it was the story of conquest, the story of innovation, the story of migration. But there are other kinds of histories that are becoming much more interesting or of interest to historians now. For example, feminist historians are very interested in the role of women. Marxist historians are very interested, for example, in the lives of poor and ordinary people, not famous people, over the last couple of hundred, if not thousands of years. So when we talk about being unbiased, what we're really talking about there is trying to imagine to ourselves, well, what are the things we're interested in? And maybe we're only telling one part of the story, not all of the story. The second thing a good historian should be is what we say is rational. In other words, we should try and look at the facts as objectively as possible. And we should be very honest about what we don't know. The opposite of rational very often is irrational or emotional, where we're very, very cross about something or very involved with something, and we just tell the history or the story of the past from that one perspective. That doesn't make good history. Thirdly, we talk about primary sources. Now, primary sources are essentially the things that were created at the time the event happened. So if we're trying to study something like, let's say, ancient Greece, we want to be reading things that were written at that time, because anything that's written about ancient Greece now obviously is very far away from the actual event. And primary sources can be a whole range of things. They can be letters that people wrote to each other. They can be pieces of art or statues that can tell a story and tell us about them. They can be the architecture itself. So why are buildings or cities laid out in a particular way? All of those things can tell us about that culture, that society at that time. It can also be historians who were alive at that time or philosophers who were alive at that time who wrote down what was happening. So again, the closer we get to the time of the event, the more likely we are to get a more complete picture. And of course, with modern techniques and modern technology, these primary sources, we're finding more and more of them all of the time. And of course, if we find something today from a long time ago, it changes how we think about that society. In other words, history is being written every single day. On top of that, a good historian looks at the past from many different perspectives, so not just from one. So again, as I said, if we give some examples from before, some historians will look at it from a men's perspective, some from a women, some even from children's perspectives, some from very famous and powerful people's perspectives, and some historians will look at it or be very interested in the experience of ordinary people, the day-to-day lives of people. Again, as we go through this module, you'll hear about these different types of historians: Marxist historians, Catholic historians, feminist historians, queer theory historians. All of these have a different emphasis. In other words, they're interested in different groups of people who are alive at different times. And as you study humanities, and if it's something you like, you might find that there are particular types of historians or philosophers that you're more interested in than others, because maybe you're interested in, for example, the lives of working class people. Maybe you're interested in the lives of women. often ignored in history, or maybe you're interested in the lives of military figures, again, a military historian perspective. So again, as we go through this module, you'll be reading history from different perspectives. I suppose at this stage, what we can say is there is no truth. There are just competing truths. And it's when you examine all of the different competing truths that you then come to a conclusion that is your own. In other words, what you think the history of a particular time or place is or what. So at this point in the lecture, I want you to just stop for a little while. And on the just above my head there, you'll see a web link that I want you to go and open in a separate web page and spend about 10 or 15 minutes reading. And really, this is a very short introduction to all of the kinds of skills and ways of thinking that a good student of the humanities should have. So have a read of this, take 10, 15, 20 minutes to do it, then maybe go and have a cup of tea or coffee, and then come back to me and continue with the lecture, okay? Okay, so now we're going to talk about Socrates. Socrates is often seen as one of the founders of Western philosophy. He was born in 470 BCE and died in 399 BCE. Now, for those of you from Europe, you probably grew up with the letters BC, which stood for before Christ. We don't use those anymore. We use BCE, before the Common Era. And the reason for that, of course, is because not everybody's a Christian who studies history. So we needed something a little bit more inclusive. So Socrates lived at this period almost 2,500 years ago, seen as one of the fathers of philosophy. His most famous student was Plato, who we'll talk about next week, and his most famous student was Aristotle. And those three men are seen as the founders of Western philosophy. So the next couple of slides will tell you a little bit about Socrates' life and the Greece that he lived in. Greece at that time of the life of Socrates was at its height. So if you've ever seen pictures of Athens with the Acropolis, this is around the time of Socrates. It was when it was divided not as one country, but into many different city-states. In fact, Greece wasn't called Greece, it was simply, they were known as Hellenes. Even today, the official name for the country of Greece is the Hellenic Republic. The two main players of those city-states at the time of Socrates were the city of Athens and the city of Sparta. And there were two very, very different cultures. Sparta, characterized by warriorness, by physical ability, a place that was seen to be quite cruel from a modern perspective. When children were born, they were immediately taken from their mothers and placed on mountaintops and left overnight. And if they survived being on a mountaintop on their own all night, they were worthy to be included in Spartan society. And if they died, well, they simply died. Athens was quite different. Athens was, by modern standards, a more cultured society in terms of it had a more fine type of architecture and had a more fine type of economics. Both city-states had a set of alliances all around the now Greek peninsulas, and they were engaged in a set of wars against each other known as the Peloponnesian Wars. So to understand Socrates, you really have to understand that broader context I spoke about earlier, and that context was the Peloponnesian War. The next couple of slides have some facts about that war that you can read yourself. I already gave you something to watch. And about 2 slides from now, you'll have a 10-minute video by a woman called Bettany Hughes. Now, Bettany Hughes is probably, if not the world's, certainly one of the world's greatest authorities on ancient Greece. And her most recent book on this subject was called The Hemlock Cup. Hemlock was the poison that was given to Socrates to drink at the end of his trial. And it was thought that's how he took his own life in the end, by drinking hemlock. And again, if you're particularly interested in this period of history, that's a book I would highly recommend. So make sure you listen to the 10 or 12 minutes with Bettany Hughes before we move on to the rest of the lecture. So here to my right, you have a map of ancient Greece. Highlighted there in purple are the area that were in alliance with the main city of Sparta. Sparta's quite down south there. You'll see it underlined in red. And then that more corally orangey colored area is the part of the ancient world that was controlled by Athens. And again, you'll see Athens not too far away from Sparta, also underlined there with red. If you look at along that red or that coral colored area, it includes what is mostly today parts of Western Turkey. So the ancient Greek world included a lot of what today we would call Turkey, including cities like Troy. So that's just something to bear in mind. Um, if you look at the map, you'll notice that there were many other smaller cities and smaller places involved in this world. And what you'll also notice, of course, is there are many, many islands. And that meant, of course, that both city-states had to have relatively good navies in order to compete against each other. Just above the map, you'll see another YouTube uh, address. So this will give you a very short 10-minute introduction to the Peloponnesian War. So before you progress with the rest of the lecture, I'd ask you just to cut and paste or type that YouTube link into another web browser and to use that and to listen to that before you go on to the next slide. So just before we finish and summarize what we discussed today, just to keep in mind that before I meet you next Tuesday, to please have read The Apology by Plato. And as I mentioned earlier, it is a tough reading. The good news is it is the toughest reading on the module. So have a go at it. Don't leave it till the last minute. You won't be able to read this on Tuesday morning. You'll need to do this over a few days. So again, break that down for yourself and read it maybe from Friday over the weekend. Give it 10 or 15 minutes at a time. So by now, having looked at all of the stuff we've looked at today, what you should be able to do and keep in mind for future lectures is you should know how to read a text. And that's worth repeating. It's the rule of three. Firstly, you read it in one go just to try and get a handle on roughly what it's about. And if you find you don't understand, just keep going, keep reading. The second time, you read it with the intention of understanding. So you take out your highlighter, you highlight what you think are the important parts of the text. And the third and final time, you just read the highlighted pieces. And this is how you go about reading all academic texts. And you'll get faster at it, and you'll notice over time you're highlighting less and less because you get better at knowing what the critical points are. Always know who wrote the text. So anytime you read anything, always try and remember, or at least know who wrote it. Always ask yourself, what kind of a text is it? Is it a novel? Is it a journal? Is it a dialogue? Is it a play? And always be able to answer that as well, because that matters. As well, ask yourself, where do the events of the text take place? Okay, the location, where in the world did it happen? When did the events happen? Was it 500 years ago, 700 years ago? Was it 2 weeks ago? Always know the when. Also ask yourself, what was happening in the world at the same time, particularly in that area of the world? What was going on? And again, when we think about Socrates, we cannot understand Socrates unless we also understand the Peloponnesian Wars. So that's the historical context. The most difficult one, the seventh point here beside me, is what were the key points the author is trying to make? In other words, what are his or her key arguments? And again, eventually you will be able to do that quickly. For now, that will be a struggle, but it cannot be ignored. If you ignore that, all you'll be doing is summarizing or shortening what you've read. And that really is something you only do in secondary school. In college, this is where all the brownie points are, is knowing what the key points of the text are. So spend time on that. And finally, remember to ask yourself, what examples has the author given to back up his argument? So for next week, as I said, when we talk next Tuesday, you'll have read Plato's Apology. It'll be much more interactive than this, obviously, and I'll be asking you to answer some of these questions. So when you're reading it, try and answer all of the questions that are on this screen, but also try and maybe document your impressions. Did you find it difficult? What bits did you find interesting? What words did you not understand? And again, some of these words are worth remembering. Usually during the course of your academic career, during the course of your degree, 3, 4, 5 years, you'll probably accumulate about 3,000 new words every year. That's part of education. And you don't learn those by rote, you learn them by reading and trying to understand. Remember, patience is the most important skill you will ever have in college. It takes time to learn. So you cannot remember everything when you're learning it at the time, but it will slowly come together to make sense. You have to trust yourself when it comes to learning. Anyway, enjoy this, enjoy the reading, the apology, enjoy the video clips on this lecture, and I will talk to you next Tuesday. Bye bye for now.